Okay, we'll go ahead and get started now. We appreciate you being here. We're in the book of Hebrews, chapter 11. It's been 3 weeks now since we met. The last time we met, we finished talking about the faith of Abraham and how many times his faith had been tested by God from the time that he was called to leave his community there and head off to the land of Canaan to leave his family. That was a test of his faith. There was a test of his faith when God told him that he and his wife Sarah would have a child by that same time the next year. This is a time when Abraham was nearing 100 years of age and his wife Sarah 90. And so it seemed like an impossibility. But he believed what God had promised him. But the greatest test he had of all, we talked about last week, was when God commanded him to sacrifice his only begotten son. That is, sacrifice Isaac, the one through whom God had said that the blessings would come to all nations. It's promises that God had made. And yet Abraham believed God, that, it's going to be through Isaac, and yet he's telling me to take Isaac and he sacrifice him. He believed that somehow or another it would be possible that God would raise him up from the dead. Now, we talked about that last time we met, and when we begin tonight, really we're going to be in chapter 11 at verse 20 to talk about the subsequent blessings of Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph, and about their faith that they had in God. And so beginning at verse 20 and reading through verse 22, the text tells us, by faith Isaac blessed Jacob and Esau concerning things to come. By faith Jacob, when he was dying, blessed each of the sons of Joseph and worshipped, leaning on the top of his staff. By faith Joseph, when he was dying, made mention of the departure of the children of Israel and gave instructions concerning his bones. And so these three individuals he talks about in the faith that they had, and the first one he mentioned is the faith of Isaac. And what I told you to be thinking about last week, or not last week, 3 weeks ago, in regard to Isaac, about how old was Isaac when Abraham is commanded to sacrifice him? Some have said anywhere from 12 and under or 20 and up, because if he'd been a teenager, it wouldn't have been a sacrifice. Now, we really don't know how old he was at the time, because the Bible doesn't tell us. God didn't see a need in us knowing how old Isaac was. But it was interesting to me reading about it. Josephus, he was a historian of the Jews, lived during the time of Christ. He said that Isaac was about 25 years of age at this time. Now, stop and think about that. How old would Abraham have been then? 125. He was near 100, when God blesses him or tells him he's going to have that child. So, if he's 125 years old and his son Isaac is 25, and you've got to take that boy and lift him up onto an altar and take his life, be hard to do that without some cooperation from Isaac. And so, a lot of people have pointed out, and I think Josephus is one of them, talks about, that Isaac himself manifested the same faith in God that Abraham had. He had that faith that if this is what God has commanded, this is what we need to do, and somehow or another, he'll be brought back to life by God. He'll be resurrected again. And so he had that same kind of faith. And yet, when the Hebrew writer wants to talk about the faith of Isaac, he says nothing about that. The text here says, by faith Isaac blessed Jacob and Esau concerning things to come. And so his faith is not in regard to that, but it's in regard to the blessing he gave to Jacob and Esau concerning things to come, concerning things yet into the future. Yes, sir?
When Abraham left his servants, he said, I'll take the lad. So he probably wasn't 25 years old.
Well, he's going with him. He wanted those two servants to stay there, and him and the boy are going on.
He said, I'll take the lad.
Yeah.
Everybody's a lad.
That's right. Yeah. Yes, sir. Yeah, he had to carry the load of wood. His father carried the knife and the fire. So that may have some idea of the age differences there too. But anyhow, the fact that if that's the case, you would think, man, that's a great faith. You ought to talk about his faith in that regard too. That he's willing to accept what his daddy tells him here and said, Dad, if God's told you to sacrifice me, then that's what we need to do, and I'm willing to go along with it. But he doesn't mention that. That doesn't mean that didn't happen. It wasn't that way. But the Hebrew writer, in talking about the faith of Isaac, doesn't talk about it. He talks about how he had blessed Jacob and Esau concerning things to come. In fact, all three of these men that we talk about here, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph, all of them, their faith is in regard to things yet into the future. It's at times when they are approaching their own death. And so it's concerning things they haven't seen yet. But they believe it. And so, again, when we talk about when we began, he first talked about faith, that faith is the evidence of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. And so, in regard to the faith of these men, it's talking about it in that same way. And here, especially now with Isaac, by faith, Isaac blessed Jacob and Esau. Now, how does that manifest his faith? Okay, yeah, and so it's still about things yet in the future. He hasn't seen this happen yet. It hasn't come to pass yet. But he believes that what God has said is going to come to pass in these boys. And so he talks about it in regard to them. It's concerning things to come. That they're looking toward things that they've not seen, but have that faith and confidence that it's going to come to them. Now, thinking about the blessings here that Isaac's going to give to Jacob and Esau, and blessing them. How did Isaac receive that blessing from his father Abraham? What's that? Through deceit. In what way? Yeah, he pretended to be Esau. He and his mother worked together to deceive their father and to appear to be that Jacob was appearing to be Esau there. And so Isaac is being deceived by that. Well, when you look about that here, though, what Isaac is doing, he received a blessing by deceit, but in giving it, Jacob did, excuse me, over Esau. But when Isaac is blessing Jacob and Esau, it's in regard to things still in the future and what he's going to give to them. And so the text tells us here about then Jacob and Esau, the same thing. By faith, Jacob, when he was dying, blessed each of the sons of Joseph. Now remember, Jacob received the blessing by deceit. Deceived his father Isaac into believing that he was Esau. And so he received the blessings that should have gone to Esau. Why should it have gone to Esau? He was the oldest. They were the ones supposed to get the lion's share of the blessing, get twice what any of the others would get. And so, but he deceives them, so he gets that. And Esau later, repents of it. And later on he talks about that here in the book of Hebrews. He'll mention that in chapter 12, that Esau sought it, but though he sought it with tears, it couldn't be given to him. And that blessing had been made already to Jacob. Now, when Jacob blesses then the sons of Joseph, how did he do that? His two sons. Who were the two sons of Joseph? Manasseh and Ephraim. Which one's the oldest? Manasseh was the oldest. Now when Joseph brought his two sons to Jacob to be blessed by them, Jacob crossed his hands. And so his right hand was on the head of Ephraim, the youngest. And Joseph said, no, Father, no. Well, no, he's going to do it this way. He's going to give the blessing to the youngest son. Now, he got it by deceit. Being the youngest, he got it by deceiving, getting it from his oldest brother Esau. But this time, he is deliberately going to make sure that he's giving it to the youngest son. Now, why? And by the way, why, after Isaac had been deceived and he blessed Jacob with a greater blessing than Esau, why didn't he change that? Yeah, he can't go back on it. But he has no intention of doing it. Even though he learns he's been deceived by it, he insists over and over again, no, the blessing is going to be for Jacob. He sees this as the workings of God, the seed that's going to him. And now, here it is when Jacob is going to be giving the blessing to the sons of Joseph. It's the same thing. He's not deceived. He's going to give that blessing, the greater blessing, to the youngest, because he sees in this that it's the will of God, that it's through the youngest that these blessings.
Didn't Esau argue away his birthright?
Yes. Right. Yeah, he did. He was willing to sell it to his brother. But I think that's one of the foolish things that he did. But, you know, it was just interesting to me here that Jacob is going to make sure that he gives that blessing to the youngest of Joseph's sons. And there's got to be a reason for that. It's got to be that he sees this is the will of God. It's concerning things yet to come in the future. And so that shows his faith. You know, how do you know what's going to happen to these two boys? How do you know what's going to happen to Ephraim and to Manasseh? And whether or not they'll even live to know these blessings. Well, it's because of his faith. His faith in the promises that God has made, that he has that he's willing to do that he's going to make sure that he gives those blessings in that way. Because evidently, it's been made known to him by God that that's to be it. And then he goes on, it says then, in regard to Joseph, and I'm get behind on this. By faith, Jacob, when he was dying, blessed each of the sons of Joseph and worshiped, leaning on the top of his staff. Now, just reading this, I would never have noticed this. I'm not really, I guess, that careful sometimes in my reading. But the latter part here, it talks about this, worshiped leaning on the top of his staff. That is in regard to an event that occurred earlier than this event when he's blessing these two sons, that promise is made to him. So anyhow, you know, that here, again though, it's on the fact that it's when Jacob, when he was dying, blessed these sons. So again, he's making these blessings not based upon what he has seen, but based upon what he's heard, what he has learned from God. It's his faith and confidence in God that he can give these blessings to these two sons, giving it to the youngest Ephraim over Manasseh, the oldest of them. And so he keeps that in regard. Now, if you look at the account given in Genesis chapter 47, verses 29 to 31, the text says, when the time drew near that Israel must die, he called his son Joseph and said to him, now, if I have found favor in your sight, please put your hand under my thigh and deal kindly and truly with me. Please do not bury me in Egypt, but let me lie with my fathers. You shall carry me out of Egypt and bury me in their burial place. And he said, I will do as you have said. Then he said, swear to me. And he swore to him. So Israel bowed himself on the head of his bed. So that's what he's talking about in the latter part of that verse there, about he worshiped leaning on the top of his staff. It was at that time now that he's talking about now when he's getting Joseph to swear to him that you will not leave my body here in Egypt, but you'll take me and bury me in the land with my fathers. So again, he's looking forward to what event? When did that occur? Yeah, it's when Moses, frees them and leads them out to the land of Canaan. That's when they take the bones of Joseph with them. Now, but Joseph is talking about it. He's getting them to swear that you'll do this for me when he's saying about things that are going to happen far into the future. Israel's going to be in slavery there for over 400 years. And so it's something way into the future. He hasn't seen, but he knows the promise of God. That God has said, I'm going to deliver my people here. They're going to be enslaved. And in time, I will deliver them and bring them back to that land that I promised to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. And so Joseph, believing what God has said, knowing that that's going to occur, makes his son swear that you will not leave my bones here, but that you will carry me out when that time comes, and you leave for the land of Canaan. And so that was the faith that these three men had. All of them having faith in regard to the future, based upon what God has said. Now, what kind of faith do we have in regard to things of the future? There are a lot of things that have been promised us. Jesus made the promise when he left this earth that he was going to do what? He was going to come again. Now, he still hasn't come yet. Been nearly 2,000 years and still not here. Do you still believe it? You haven't seen it happen, but your faith is not based upon sight, but it's based upon the Word of God and the promise that God made in this regard. And when we look at the faith of these men, we've got to have that kind of faith, a kind of faith that trusts in God and what He said, even though the things that He's promised haven't happened yet. We have that confidence that it will come about. Now, when we get this next section here, chapter 11, verses 23, 28, he turns to start talking now, not about the patriarchs, but talking about Moses. And he's going to spend some time talking about Moses. And that's one reason why I think it's because of the importance of this man, Moses. One of the most important men in all of the Bible, especially in regard to the Old Testament. In fact, when we talk about the Old Testament, we talk about the old law, what do we sometimes call it? The law of Moses. You know, and the Jews in the days of Christ, when they were talking about, someone would say, are you a disciple of Christ? And they say, well, look, we are Moses' disciples. You know, they go all the way back to him. They look to him in that regard. And so we're going to be talking now about the faith of Moses. And yet, it's interesting when he begins here, Hebrews 11, 23 through 28, and we'll get those other two verses in just a moment. By faith, Moses, when he was born, was hidden 3 months by his parents because they saw he was a beautiful child and they were not afraid of the king's command. By faith, Moses, when he became of age, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to suffer affliction with the people of God than to enjoy the passing pleasures of sin, esteeming the reproach of Christ greater riches than the treasures in Egypt, for he looked to the reward. By faith he forsook Egypt, not fearing the wrath of the king, for he endured as seeing him who is invisible. By faith he kept the Passover and the sprinkling of blood, lest he who destroyed the firstborn should touch them. So, the faith of Moses. Now, in these first few verses, obviously, it's not really talking about the faith of Moses. Whose faith is it talking about? Talking about the faith of his parents. That's interesting. You say the faith of his mother. And it's interesting because the Hebrew writer here, the writer of the book of Hebrews, talks about the faith of his parents. But in Genesis, what does it talk about? Talks what? Yeah, look at Exodus chapter 2, 1 through 3. It says, and a man of the house of Levi went and took a wife, a daughter of Levi. So the woman conceived and bore a son. And when she saw that he was a beautiful child, she hid him 3 months. And when she could no longer hide him, she took an ark of bulrushes for him, daubed it with asphalt and pitch, put the child in it, and laid it in the reeds by the river's bank. It just talks about his mother doing this. But the Hebrew writer, who follows not the Hebrew Old Testament, but the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Old Testament, follows that, which says the parents. It's talking about the faith of his parents. Now, I don't see that as being a real discrepancy, a contradiction or anything. I think both of them had to have been involved in it. I don't think one parent by themselves could have succeeded in keeping this a secret from everybody without the help of the other one to making sure that they could do that. And so she keeps this child hid for 3 months. Now, it's interesting to me as I think about that, the question I get from that. I'm getting behind here again. Let's do it this way. All right, the Hebrew text mentions only his mother, but both parents, I believe, would have had to have been involved in to do that. Now, they hid him for 3 months to protect him. Then what did they do? Put him afloat. Now, this passage that I put up there, I got it a little too quick. This is a passage I've been familiar with for a long time, and I've used it several times. When David says, "When my father and my mother forsake me, then the Lord will take care of me." Now, I always thought of that in regard maybe to where maybe mom and dad don't believe in God, or they don't believe in Jesus, and the child does. And so maybe they reject their child because of that, you know. And maybe decide, hey, you're not going to inherit anything from me as long as you're carrying around those foolish beliefs. And I say that because I've talked before about Brother Ton Kuhn, who grew up. His father was probably the richest man in all of Asia. But when he was a young boy, about 13 or 14, World War II, he met some American soldiers who happened to be members of the church, and they taught him the truth. And he decided he wanted to become a Christian. So he went and told his daddy, I want to become a Christian. And his daddy said, absolutely not. We're not going to have anything to do with it. In fact, his father told him, if you go through with this and become a Christian, then I'm disowning you. And you'll no longer be my son. So he made the decision to become a Christian. And his daddy was faithful to his word. He kicked him out of the house. Imagine 13 or 14 years old in the time of World War II, and you've been put out of your own home. And I thought, well, in a situation like that, God took him up because he got help from other Christians, these soldiers and all who'd worked with him. They were able to help raise money, get him over to America, went to school at Freed-Hardeman, which was a junior college at that time, and later went back to preach the gospel there in the Philippines. And I was in school with his daughter at Freed-Hardeman. And I've always thought, all right, that's it. When your parents reject you, then God will take you up. But as I was studying through this and looking in different books, different commentaries, and Brother Burton Kaufman is the one that pointed out, he says, when David wrote this, surely he could have had Moses in mind. And I've never thought about it in that respect. His parents weren't rejecting him. They kept him hidden and protected for as long as they could. But when it got to the point where they realized we can't protect him anymore, it's going to be hard for us to keep him hid. So they make this little basket. They make it waterproof, and they put the baby Moses in that and set it afloat out there on the river. Now, that shows the faith that his parents had. We've done all we can to protect our child and to keep him safe, but now we're not going to be able to do that anymore, so we're putting him into the care of God, trusting that God will take care of him. And God did. When his parents, forsook him, that is, they had to put him out there, then God took care of him. And it's one of the greatest accounts in all the Bibles you can read about what God does for him, for this child. Yes, sir.
How do you explain when it says that she did that after seeing that he was a beautiful child? Some people will say, well, if he was an ugly duckling,
well, I was going to say, look,
she
that
would have thrown him to the crocodile.
yeah. Well, that's what I'm putting up here now, because why did Amram and Jochebed hide Moses? That was his parent. And two reasons. That's one of them. They saw he was a beautiful child. Now, questions. When your children were born, did you think they were beautiful children? Everybody thinks their child is beautiful. And I guess everybody is going to think, it's hard to find anything more beautiful than a child. But there's more to it than just being a beautiful child. There are different translations, renders of this.
Evidently, they was afraid that Pharaoh might have him killed.
Well, they knew that was going to be the case, because that's what Pharaoh had already commanded, that would be done. And we'll look at the verses on that. But just Acts 7 in verse 20, when Stephen is talking about Moses, he says, at this time Moses was born and was pleasing to God. It's the same thing, but instead of saying, and was a beautiful child, he says, and was pleasing to God, and he was brought up in his father's house for 3 months. There was something about Moses that caused his parents to realize God has something special in plan for him. Stephen indicates something like this because he says it was, it wasn't just that the parents said this is a beautiful child, but that God was the one who was pleased with him. God had something in mind maybe for him. Now, again, Josephus, I don't know where he gets his information, just a common belief maybe among many of the Jewish people, but Josephus said that God gave a vision by nights to Moses' father to let him know that God had something special in mind for him. And that's why they went to this effort of hiding him for 3 months, and when they couldn't do it any longer, they said, look, God's got something in plan for my child, then I'm leaving him to God's care. And that's what they've done. And boy, look at how God took care of him. I mean, it's just unbelievable in all of that. But that may be the possibility of it here. Something else. Exodus chapter 3, 9, and 10. Brother Pace mentioned this in writing about all of these things. He says in Exodus 3, 9, and 10, now therefore, this is when God is speaking to Moses at the burning bush. Now therefore, behold, the cry of the children of Israel has come to me, and I have also seen the oppression with which the Egyptians oppressed them. Come now, therefore, and I will send you to Pharaoh, that you may bring my people, the children of Israel, out of Egypt. So God's talking to Moses. This is many, many years now after his parents had put him afloat out there on the Nile River. But maybe among the cries of Israel that went up to God may have included the cries of Amram and Jochebed to God for their child. If you've got something special planned for our child and we can't protect him any longer, we're setting him out here dependent upon you to be the one to protect him. Now, either way you go on that, I think that shows a great faith on the part of Moses' parents. Think of all the dangers, the things that could have happened, that could have gone wrong in putting that child out there on the Nile River. Where does the Nile River go to? To the Mediterranean. What happens if a current gets that thing and whisks it out to sea? Or what if the wind's blowing across that, cause waves that swamps that little basket? And something I've thought about, and Steve mentioned a while ago, some of the Nile crocodiles, they are huge and vicious animals. What's to keep them from getting my child? Now, if Amram and Jochebed thought about anything like that, it never affected their decision. They didn't look at the negative. They didn't look at the possibilities of things going wrong. They looked at the God of power that they served and what he could do. And if God has something special in plan for their child Moses, God can take care of him. And so they have that faith and that confidence and trust in him. And that's the kind of faith that he's talking about here. The faith that his parents had. By faith, that's the emphasis given there in regard to that. By faith, Moses, when he was born, was hid for 3 months by his parents because they saw that he was a child, that the child was beautiful. That was the first reason. And the second reason, they were not afraid of the king's commandment. So understand about the commandment. First of all, there are a couple of passages there in the Old Testament. I've just put them all together here. But Exodus 1, 15 and 16 is when he's speaking to the midwives among the Jews who are delivering these children. And the king of Egypt spoke to the Hebrew midwives, of whom the name of one was Shiphrah and the name of the other Puah. And he said, when you do the duties of a midwife for the Hebrew women and see them on the birth stools, if it is a son, then you shall kill him. But if it is a daughter, then she shall live. And then later, verse 22, so Pharaoh commanded all his people, saying, every son who is born you shall cast into the river, and every daughter you shall save alive. So start off just initially with the midwives, telling them, hey, when you're assisting these Jewish women give birth, if they give birth to a boy, you kill it. If it's a girl, let it live. But later on, he gives command to all the people. Any child, any of the son that's born among the Jews, is the one he's talking about, is to be cast into the river. Well, I guess in a sense, Amram and Jochebed did that. They put their son out on the river, but they're trusting God to take care of them, and He does. But they're not afraid of the king's commands. If they were fearful of him, and we don't know what the consequences would be, because again, the Bible doesn't tell us, but it had to be something to be extremely severe to disobey the king's commands and save those children instead of putting them to death like he's commanded. But they're not afraid of that. They're not afraid what the king might do to them. They're going to do what they can to spare their child, and especially if it's the case that their child is something special in the eyes of God, to be used by God in some special way. And so they're not afraid of what the king might do to them. And I think that, again, that shows their faith that they have in God. Even if their own life might be in danger for what they're doing, they're not going to allow that fear to keep them from doing what they know needs to be done. The kind of faith and confidence they have in God. Again, that's the kind of faith that we need to have today in our lives. We need to have that faith and confidence in God to take care of it. Now, I'm not one to talk much about this. I'll leave it up to Amram and Jochebed to be the examples here, because too many times I see the negative things. I see the things that can go wrong, and even sometimes when a proposal is made for something that we need to do, I think, I don't know. That doesn't sound very reasonable to me, maybe. I can see all the possibilities of things going wrong. Instead of stop looking at what could go wrong and look at the God we're serving. He's a God that has all power, and if what we're doing is His will, if we're involved in carrying out His will, as Amram and Jochebed are doing, we need to have full confidence that it's going to be successful. Because if it's His will, it's what He wants done. And we need to have that confidence. And so these parents had that kind of faith and that kind of confidence in God, and that's why they were willing to do these things. And they weren't afraid of anything that might happen to them as a result of this. And so they're willing to go ahead and do that. They're not afraid of the king's commands. Sometimes, it happens to people. It even happens to Christians where we get fearful of what might happen if we do something. And we let the fear keep us from doing what needs to be done. And I know I've talked about this so many times, but just over and over again in the Bible, you see that fact that fear keeps God's people from doing what God wants them to do. The one-talent man, what was his problem? He was afraid. And so that kept him from using the talent that he'd been given. And sometimes we fail to use the talents that we have because we're afraid of messing things up or whatever. But we can't allow that fear to keep us from serving God and doing what He wants us to do. Revelation 21:8 talks about those who are going to be in the lake of fire. It burns with brimstone, And number one on the list is the fearful. Because of fear, it keeps us from doing God's will. And that failure to do God's will is going to cause so many people to be lost. And so, but his parents are not afraid. That doesn't concern them one whit. What this king says and what he has commanded. They're going to do what needs to be done. And so that's their faith they have. But when you get into chapter 11, verse 24, it starts talking about the actual faith of Moses himself. Now, we'll look at a few of these verses here. Well, I put that up there too soon. The faith of Moses himself. When Brother Kaufman gets to this point in his commentary in this next section, he introduces it with these words. Like parents, like son. The faith that you see first in Amram and Jochebed, you see that same faith later in their son Moses. Now the passage I put up there, because this is something that just occurred to me when it happened. When Paul talks about the faith of Timothy, Paul says, when I call to remembrance the genuine faith that is in you, which dwelt first in your grandmother Lois and your mother Eunice, and I am persuaded is in you also. Like parents, like son. The faith that his mother had is found in Timothy. And the faith that was in Amram and Jochebed is found to be in Moses. What was the first thing that they did? Well, when the text talks about their faith that they had, they refused to obey the king's command. His command was, if the child born is a boy, he's to be thrown into the river. He's to be put to death. They refused to do that. They refused to do it or to allow their son to be killed. They hid him for 3 months and then put him out into the care of God. Now, when Moses' faith is talked about, what's the first evidence of his faith? He refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter. Isn't that interesting? Like parents, like son, their faith, they refused to obey the commands of that king. And Moses' faith being manifested here. As he talks about, he refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter. He had that same kind of faith, and he got that faith from his parents. We know his mother is the one who nursed him. She was the one brought in to nurse him while he was under the care of Pharaoh's daughter. But now,
So somebody told him that he wasn't.
that's right. That's right. And he had to learn that somehow. We're not told how, but maybe his own mother is letting him know these things. And she's there to nurse. Now, his parents had refused to obey the king's edict to kill their son, and Moses refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter. Now, something interesting else was given me. I found that 4 examples where young men refused royal offers. Now, the first one here we talked about is Moses. Moses refused an offer. He refused a royal offer of adoption. Hey, you're born to a Hebrew woman. You're born to a people who are slaves in Egypt, to people who are abused, who are forced to labor, and many of them die under that forced labor. But you have been taken into a royal family, the daughter of Pharaoh. And you grow up as her son. You can have all the blessings that there. But he refused that. He refused the royal adoption. The second one, David. You have any idea what it was, what royal thing that David refused? He refused the armor of King Saul. He's going to go out there to fight against that giant. And Saul said, take my armor. And he tried it, and he said, I can't go with this. So he refused the royal armor. Because his confidence was not in that armor. His confidence was in God. And so he's going out to fight him. The third one. Come on. Daniel. What royal offer did he refuse? Huh? The royal food. He was to be fed, the food from the king's table. But he refused that. You know, he told them, let us eat our food and judge us for 10 days and see how things go if we're not as healthy as the other guys. And so they were like, but they refused that. Daniel did, as well as his friends. And then Jesus. What royal offer did he refuse? To rule the world, to be the king of everything. I hadn't thought about it. That's coming from Satan. You know, I'll give you all the kingdoms of the earth. But I was thinking also of when the Jews wanted to take him by force and make him king. And Jesus said, you know, you do this because of the food that you've eaten. You know, he miraculously provided food for them. So they were, well, hey, that sounds like that'd be a good king for me. He can provide all things we need. But he refused that. And so, you know, we need to give consideration in life. Sometimes the temptations may come our way, things that might be offered to us. But just stop and think, now, what is it that we really need in life? Do we need to take what's being offered, or do we need to listen to what God says and follow what God would have us to do? And so Moses here refuses to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter. Now, think about this. I don't know how long he remained there in the palace, being raised there by Pharaoh's daughter. But people that I've known who've been adopted, my daughter-in-law was adopted. And just maybe within the last 2 years, she finally got to meet her real parents. They were the ones who gave physical birth to her. But you ask her and she'll tell you, no, my real parents are those that raised me, that brought me up. And sometimes you'll see instances in the news where somebody's put a child up for adoption and that child has been adopted by another family. And then later on, the biological parent, whether it's the father or the mother, will go to court to get custody of that child. And sometimes they win the case in court and that child is taken away. And that child cries, no, you're taking me away from my parents. That's all they know. That's the ones that have raised them. Now, you think about Moses being brought up there in the palace of Pharaoh by Pharaoh's daughter. He's got to have loved that woman. He's got to have looked upon her as the one. She rescued me from drowning or being destroyed out there on the river. And she's taken me in and she's saved my life and she's taking care of me. Got to be difficult to turn away from that. But he did. And then you think about the household he's being raised in and what that must have been like. He's in a position of power, the son of Pharaoh's daughter. And some people believe he may be even been in line for becoming the next Pharaoh, to have all of that power. And that's not just power of some second-rate nation. Egypt was one of the greatest nations in the world at that time. They were of great wealth. And even today, you know, people are just amazed at the things that you find there in Egypt. You know, looking back to the pyramids and all, and wonder how in the world were they able to build things like that. Have any of you ever been able to go and see any of the displays on tour from, I know they had it down in New Orleans for a while. It was up in Memphis once. And we went while we were when it was up in Memphis, you know. And among other things, you know, they just got all these things made out of solid gold that were worn by the pharaohs and by the families of them, man. You know, you think about all the wealth that they have. Hard to give all of that up. But that's one of the things that he rejected. When we look at it sometimes, we think, that just doesn't seem possible. That a person with all of that at his disposal would be willing to give it up. Because you look at our world today, it doesn't take all of that, but just one little thing sometimes is enough to cause a person to give up a life of serving to God to get that one thing. But Moses, with all of that being offered to him, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter. And he did it all, the text said, by faith. That's how he did it. If we're going to resist temptations in life to turn us away from God and from serving God, we need a strong faith. And Moses evidently had it. And all that was given to him. Now, there's several other things about this that I want us to talk about, but our time's gone. So we'll pick up at this point next week and talk about it, what he refused and the decision that he did make, what he chose and all of that. Again, I think when you look at it and go through it step by step, you've got to seriously be amazed at the faith that Moses had. But also maybe be encouraged and inspired to strive to have that same kind of faith. All right, let's have a word of prayer and we'll be dismissed. Father, we're so grateful and thankful to Thee for all that You do for us in this life. And Father, we're grateful for the examples that You have provided for us in Your Word of the great men and women of faith who've manifested, Father, such great faith in Thee. And help us to be encouraged by it and to be determined in our lives to grow and to be at that point where we will manifest that same kind of faith in our own lives. Dismiss us now in Your care. Keep us safe and in Your will, and use us for Your glory and honor, Father, as You see best. We pray in Jesus' name. Amen.